The night I found the receipts and the lipstick on his collar, I didn't raise my voice. I learned silence is an instrument. For 2 years I watched, measured and waited, not for pain but for proof. Tonight I begin a slow, surgical unmaking. Of trust, of image, of the life she thought she'd stolen from me. I remember the morning like it was a photograph. Light through blinds, coffee steam, the ordinary choreography of our life. We had a house that smelled of lemon and power tools, 2 cars in the driveway, and a marriage that looked impressive on paper. I'm a builder by trade, not the TV kind, the kind that turns blueprints into foundations. I like concrete, it tells the truth. For years I believed Emily's laughter was my favorite sound. I believed this marriage because I had put my hands into it. But that morning, a folded receipt tucked into an old jacket on the coat rack looked nothing like the life I'd believed in. It had a name I'd never heard, an address across town, a credit card total that made the stomach tumble. What followed wasn't a confrontation but a counting. I began to count moments she lied by omission, the nights she came home delayed, the text messages she hid. I did not explode. I catalogued. There is a peculiar clarity that follows betrayal if you let it. Most people feel rage, then do something they regret. They break a window, send an angry text, smash plates. But rage is messy and visible things can be cleaned. I wanted something that couldn't be wiped away with apologies or glossy PR. I wanted to rearrange her world so the truth would arrive like a chill and not a scream. So in the weeks after the receipt, I became 2 versions of myself. The husband who smiled and the man who kept a ledger in the glove compartment. I learned the art of patience. I watched schedules, memorized small habits, and followed routes she thought were ordinary. I learned the names of the restaurants she frequented. I kept my voice even at breakfasts, and when she asked if I'd seen the new shoes or the lipstick on her collar, I shrugged and said nothing. She noticed the looking-glass silence before she noticed the ledger. At first, I thought I could save it with conversation. I pictured a scene where we would sit, truth would spill like water, and we'd either patch holes or close the door. I debated it for days, practicing the gentlest sentences. But the ledger grew. The evidence multiplied. Coffee shop receipts at hours that didn't match her calendar, a line on her credit statement for a boutique I never heard her mention, an unfamiliar perfume lingering on a sweater she'd claimed was mine. Each discovery was like a new stitch in a pattern. And patterns to me mean intention. When she came home one evening smelling like a place that was not our kitchen, she kissed my cheek and said, "Rough night." I swallowed the truth whole and smiled. "Tell me about it tomorrow," I said. She did not sleep well that night and neither did I. But mine was a focus sharpened by a decision. There would be no spectacle, only structure. If you want to ruin someone's life cleanly, you must be methodical. I made lists. Not the angry, messy kind, precise, administrative lists. Names, dates, locations. I mapped their intersection like a civil engineer mapping stress points on a bridge. Where the strain concentrated, where she broke habitually. She loved the theater downtown. She loved an Italian place on Elm. She favored a boutique hotel under an alias she used for loyalty points. All of it led to one man, a partner at a PR firm downtown named Michael, the one whose laugh ended with a cigarette and a hush. That might have been enough to hurt, but I wanted more than hurt. Hurt fades. Reputation, however, can be curated and then dismantled. Karma is slow and sometimes cruel, but I wanted a justice that was surgical. Expose the mechanics of her deceit so the fallout would be structural, not merely emotional. I confess there were nights where I considered the obvious. A confrontation, a scene in the foyer where everything broke and the neighbors called someone, but those felt like band-aids. I wanted something that would remove the infection, not just inflame it. So I turned my builder's mind toward strategy. Buildings don't collapse because of one rotten beam. They fail because the load shifts and the support is undermined. I would be the unseen hand that shifted the load. First, I needed leverage. For years I'd allowed my identity to blend into the background. A supportive husband, the man who fixed the heater, the quiet partner at PDA meetings. People admired Emily. She was polished, articulate, an Instagram architect of effortless success. Her image was immaculate. My job was to become the slow, invisible erosion that revealed the foundation beneath the facade. The first cut I made was at work. Emily ran a nonprofit marketing division for a foundation with good intentions and glossy donors. To the city she was a rising star, often in gala photos, always seen with a smile. That image produced trust and money. Reputation is currency. I started small. An anonymous email to a board member pointing out some oddities in recent vendor choices. Another note to a grant officer asking for documentation on an expense she'd overseen. I didn't lie. Every claim I made was a question, a request for transparency. People don't immediately distrust a woman who has won admirers and funding. They do, however, audit when someone asks politely for receipts. Threads unraveled. The board asked for a review. Emily smiled as she walked past me that night, confident she could withstand anything. She didn't know the ledger contained a copy of the vendor contracts I'd requested. I dusted through public records and small claims archives and found a pattern of unusual payments. The foundation called a closed meeting. When she called me, voice tight but dignified, asking if I knew what was happening, I said I would come by. I showed up not as an avenger but as the concerned husband, and I watched the first stones shift. They called it an internal review. They called it procedural. In the emails I sent, in the formal letters I requested, innocence can look like arrogance. Defensiveness can look like guilt. I watched Emily fight with the kind of poise that used to be my favorite, quick, sharp rebuttals, tearful explanations given at the right moments. But my goal was not to humiliate in a room of colleagues. It was to set the conditions where her choices would speak louder than her scripting. I arranged for a donor to ask innocently about the boutique charge. I emailed a vendor requesting backup documentation and CC'd the compliance officer. Systems are made to respond to processes. I was careful to follow them. When the auditors asked for receipts and a reconciliation, Emily produced plausible answers. Names, numbers, excuses with a practiced openness. But small mistakes show up in systems. A missed initial, a swapped date, a vendor whose business registration slides into a P.O. box. Those tiny misalignments are not lies in themselves, but they create patterns that look like negligence when traced across months. I let the pattern compile itself. While the foundation inquiries were slow, I began to dismantle another pillar, the social mirror. Emily's life had an audience, and audiences are cruel when they smell inauthenticity. People forgive a private failing but punish public deception. I started with whispers, nothing libelous, nothing false, simply carefully curated questions to people who followed her publicly. A photo with a donor in 1 month, a blurry tag at a restaurant in another. I seeded doubts, always as questions, always as did anyone notice? The social world fills in gaps with gossip, and gossip in our era is amplified by screens. I created a fake account, not for revenge porn or cruelty, but to ask benign-seeming questions. Does anyone know if Emily X donated personally to this event? Does anyone trust the vendor list? I never attacked her personally. I merely let the audience notice the wiring behind the spotlight. A single comment thread is like water. It widens the cracks into pools of suspicion. There is an art to pacing. Expose too much and people brace. Expose nothing and nothing happens. My moves had to feel accidental. A concerned neighbor, a curious donor, a bureaucratic audit. I kept my face smooth while inside I cataloged the responses. Her friends texted, their messages styled with worry and the occasional helpless defense. Her mother called and I answered with a calmness I'd never had before, saying, "We'll sort it." It's funny how people are more likely to believe in stability when they hear it from a familiar voice. Meanwhile, the ledger in my glove compartment grew fat with screenshots, bank statements, saved emails, a trail of transactions that mapped Emily's double life. I saved everything twice. Photographs, receipts, a confirmation email from the boutique with loyalty points under a different name. I archived all of it like evidence in a slow-motion trial. The other man, Michael, enjoyed a dangerous kind of invisibility. He was the shadow who only appeared in curated frames. I began to retrace his public life, the PR firm announcements, the charity galas he attended. If you remove the optics from a man who trades on them, his influence withers. I reached out to a journalist I knew from a home renovation piece, a woman who loved slow-burn narratives about corruption masked as charity. I didn't ask her to write a hit piece. I asked if she'd be willing to look into non-profit procurement processes in general. Journalists, like auditors, respond to pattern and plausibility more than moral outrage. I fed her questions gently, suggested public records to comb through. A reliable reporter begins with curiosity. If the curiosity finds factual grounds, it writes the truth. I did not push narrative. I built a trail that invited investigation. At home I played my part well. I fixed a leaky faucet with exaggerated patience. I asked about her day and meant it. There is a particular cruelty in being ordinary while carrying a slow-burning plan. It is like humming a lullaby while packing stones. Emily noticed my attention, misread it sometimes as guilt, sometimes as contrition. She started to confide, drop lines that, to her, felt like reconciliation. "We're under stress," she would say. "Work is hectic." I nodded and kept my ledger updated. When she reached for my hand on the couch, I took it and held it with a calm that suggested nothing but care. The strangest part of cruelty, if cruelty is what it was, is that it requires a generosity of small graces to be believable. I gave those graces. I also kept a separate calendar in the glove compartment with the dates of her meetings, the names that appeared on credit card statements, the arrivals and departures she thought were secret. I was patient like a geologist watching a mountain shed a landslide over centuries. When the auditors came back with requests the foundation couldn't ignore, I stepped into the role of the recruited, concerned husband. I brought copies of public records I'd legally obtained, gently suggesting the foundation clarify vendor relationships. The audit widened. Opinion began to shift in small increments. What had been a rumor turned into a file, then into a report, then into an internal memo. Emily, graceful and measured, began to fray in ways that were not immediately visible to the broader public but visible to the people who depended on her leadership. She was brilliant at deflection. She could charm donors with an easy laugh and a fast anecdote. But charm is slippery when you are asked for line-by-line accounts. The foundation put an interim director in place while they reviewed expenses. The news traveled through circles of funders, then donors, then a wider nonprofit network. Reputation, once questioned, attracts caution like iron filings to a magnet. I never tried to physically corner her. There were no confrontations at the kitchen table. Instead, I let procedural things do the work of humiliation. An email sent to the board chair asking for clarification on a contract felt like bureaucracy, not malice. But when the board chair forwarded my query to the compliance committee and CC'd the legal team, it learned the shape of escalation. Emily's phone calls became more frantic. She would come home late, excuse in hand. She told me small truths, about a lunch with Michael, about a late-night call, about how the PR firm had been helping her. Those admissions were useful. People who cheat hide, then narrate their own versions to control fallout. Every small confession she made, thinking it private, I logged. I did not shout. I filed. There is a satisfying cruelty in narratives that catch up with themselves. The journalist I nudged had a nose for detail. She noticed overlapping vendor addresses and, with legal counsel, unearthed a small network of shell vendors that had provided services at inflated rates. The story she wrote did not scream infidelity. It cataloged procurement irregularities, nepotistic hiring, a pattern of questionable expenses that often accompany conflicts of interest. The article was measured and devastating. It included quotes from donors who said they'd been left wondering. It included a line about insufficient documentation, a phrase that casts a pall. The public response was immediate. Donors paused pledges, board members tightened procedures, and the foundation's annual gala was suddenly under review. Emily called me that night with a voice that sounded like a person who had lost the ground beneath them. I listened. I did not gloat. There is a calculus to humiliation. Public revelation can destroy a life, but it can also bind people together against a target if you go too loud. I wanted to be surgical. The journalist's piece allowed people to draw their own inferences. It did not mention Michael by name. It did, however, include enough detail that people connected dots. The boutique charges, the hotel loyalty points under a different name, the timing of expenses correlated with personal events. The article also made clear that an internal review was underway. Suddenly, Emily's public virtue was reframed as potential mismanagement. Her carefully curated image of competence and warmth started to wobble. I watched the slow thinning of her circles. Invites that used to arrive stopped, donors who previously attended galas politely declined, and colleagues began speaking to her with different eyes that measured and waited. Michael experienced pressure too. PR men live by relationships. When a client's light dims, they shift. People at his firm began to ask questions about the dinner bills, whether the firm had benefited indirectly from recommendations. Rumors are engines that run on little more than a scent of impropriety. They will run until someone stops them or until they hit legal ice. He tried to maintain distance in public, but insiders could read tension. When a partner at his firm asked him to step away from certain accounts, temporarily, he took it badly. For a man who traffics in stories, losing narrative control is catastrophic. He reached out to Emily in the early days after the article, desperate for reassurance. I knew because she told me in the bathroom between meetings, trying to steady her voice. She asked what to do. I suggested she let procedures play out. I did not offer legal advice. In her panic, she called Michael, who told her things that comforted but preserved nothing. Under pressure, people talk and make mistakes. As the foundation tightened, donors demanded refunds or explanations. Contracts were examined, invoices scrutinized, board minutes reviewed. The compliance team found items missing supporting documentation, and those omissions are the language of suspicion. For a woman whose identity rested partly on being the reliable face of a cause, this erosion of trust is a slow, choking suffocation. I sat at home calculating, not for pleasure, but because in this new world numbers told a story that emotion could not alter. The ledger's columns matched the auditor's findings. When the legal team called Emily for an interview, she turned to me and said, "I don't know what to do." I told her plainly, "Tell the truth." It's funny how the simplest counsel can be the most cutting. Telling the truth invites a collapse sometimes, telling half-truths invites a slower failure. Then the unexpected happened. A donor, incensed that their money had been allocated in odd ways, asked for a public accounting and began posting messages on forums frequented by philanthropy watchers. These forums can be brutal because they value transparency above personality. They are not interested in scandal so much as stewardship. The thread grew. People began to share screenshots and links. A small group that had previously admired Emily now speculated as to whether she'd crossed ethical lines. The conversation was surgical because it was evidence-based. Devotees turned into skeptics slowly, like a stain spreading on a white tablecloth. There is no greater punishment in our circles than the slow withdrawal of confidence. Invitations fell off calendars, and board members wondered aloud whether their own reputations could be at risk by association. What I found most revealing in all this collapse was not her anger but her choices under pressure. Some people, when threatened with exposure, run to the people who can help them spin. Others confess and attempt repair. Emily tried both. She called Michael seeking solidarity and he offered platitudes. She begged a close friend to stay in her corner and was met with polite distance. She emailed donors with polished apologies. She tried to craft an explanation that would sound like accountability, but accountability requires sacrifice, the acceptance of consequences and the willingness to change. She offered phrases like, "I take responsibility," without the specific steps donors need to believe in. That gap is fatal to trust. I watched as colleagues who had once laughed at her jokes now positioned themselves carefully in meetings, their smiles measured. The social scaffolding that had held her collapsed in small, social increments. This was the moment I had been pacing toward, not the exposure itself but the aftershock. I had not wanted to ruin her by exposing private betrayal, though that would have destroyed us both morally. I wanted her public life to reflect the decisions she'd made in private. She had crafted a persona out of our shared resources, consuming things she'd not accounted for, that mattered more to the world that had trusted her. I had a choice. I could make the private infidelity the center of the fallout, or I could let the public misuse of trust be the narrative. I chose the latter. When the board called an emergency session, I sent a concise packet. All legally obtained documents, meticulously organized with a cover letter asking for clarity. I did not include salacious details about Michael. I did not leak texts. I wanted structural consequences, not spectacle. The board, confronted with records and the pressure of donors and the journalist's piece, had no theatrical options. They had to respond. They placed her on administrative leave. It was a polite phrasing for a sharp public blow. The announcement was terse, couched in concern, promising transparency and an investigation. Emily stood at the window that evening and watched the city's lights bluntly, as if searching for a horizon that would not move. I remember the silence like a second skin. She turned to me and said, "You did this." There was accusation instead of gratitude, and I felt nothing but the exact, cool sense of completion. "I asked questions," I said. "I wanted the truth." She counted our history like someone counting the crumbs of a cake, not the recipe, only the aftermath. She accused me loudly in private, but in public she gave measured responses and, eventually, legal counsel. In the weeks that followed, the Foundation issued a public statement promising reforms, an independent audit and a return to fiduciary rigor. They announced policy changes. Donors signed on to new oversight committees. The gala was postponed. Emily, now in counsel's hands, became the subject of careful press coverage that emphasized process and propriety. People debated the balance between private mistakes and professional oversight. Michael left his firm under vague terms and took a job in a different state. Friends who had once praised Emily's savvy avoided direct comment. Some defended her, insisting on due process. Others, newly wary, quietly rescinded commitments. The life we had built together, the house, the dinners, the carefully curated friends, felt strained along the seams. I could see now that the lights were dimmed. And yet, beneath all the procedural logic and public statements, there was a quieter, nastier consequence that I had also nurtured: the social bankruptcy. She could maintain legal deniability. She could perhaps, with counsel, navigate the audit and return to some measure of professional life. But I knew the subtler currency, trust, is stubborn. Once it flees, certain doors close forever. Invitations to panels ceased. Her speaking engagements evaporated. People who used to ask her advice now asked the auditors. I watched her try to rebuild in the months that followed and found the city colder than before. People who had once sought photographs now paused before smiling. Trust, in that world, is a compound interest. You accumulate it slowly and hemorrhage it instantly. I did not gloat. There is an emptiness in triumph when the means require others' suffering. My revenge, carefully executed, did not bring joy so much as relief. The ledger in my glove compartment no longer pulsed with new evidence. It had served its purpose. Somewhere in the middle of the aftermath, I took the receipts and filed them away. Life returned in a new cadence. We moved through rooms like strangers with a shared mortgage. We attended the same function once, an awkward dinner where people pretended not to notice the gap between us. She was polite. I was measured. When someone asked if we were okay, we offered smiles that were brittle. The neighbors speculated. The children's school teacher noticed a change in her tone. Some nights she cried into the pillow. Other nights she slept with the small, forgetful detachment of someone who hopes time will sew back what was torn. Months later, I found a small note in a drawer, a scrap of paper with an apology she had scribbled and then discarded. "I'm sorry," it said in a hand that trembled. It was not a confession so much as a regret that had not yet chosen its direction. I kept the scrap. I didn't frame it. I didn't hand it back. I let it be a private relic of a public unraveling. People asked me in concerned voices if I wanted to reconcile, if I was angry, if I planned to leave. I said that truth and responsibility are prerequisites for repair. Some people left sympathy messages. Others quietly suggested divorce lawyers. But I watched more than I acted. The smart revenge I had chosen was not about cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was about aligning consequences with choices. She had spent our shared capital and then presented a face of virtue. The world corrected for the imbalance. That correction was not my pleasure. There is a final piece I should confess. In the quiet, away from emails and auditors and public statements, I realized how complicit I had been in forgetting myself. For years I allowed my identity to sit quietly beside hers, supporting, fixing, nodding. Not because I was lesser, but because I trusted the currency of intimacy. Betrayal exposes how one-sided that ledger can be. My response, surgical and staged, might seem cold. Perhaps it was. But what else was there? I had choices, a scene, a meltdown, a plea. Instead, I chose structure because structure is durable. It resists the storms of spectacle and leaves the truth in the records. In the end, what matters is the alignment between actions and consequences. She paid a price measured by the institutions she led and the networks that trusted her. Michael lost a chapter of his public life. Donors learned to ask for receipts. I learned to ask for transparency in ways I had not before. People will sometimes ask me, with a strange mixture of curiosity and moral calculation, whether I regret the path I took. The answer is complicated. I regret the loss, the way our shared life hollowed. I regret that our children, if we had them, if they overheard the old arguments, might feel the tremor of two adults who failed to place the same value on fidelity. But I do not regret the principle that guided me, that trust, when used as a public currency, must be accounted for. If you present yourself as a steward, you must be accountable. If you use the guise of charity to hide personal gain, the architecture of that life becomes unstable. I do not take pleasure in witnessing collapse. I take somber satisfaction in a system functioning when prompted. Systems, after all, are beside the people who believe they can be above them. Some nights, alone, I imagine an alternate sequence of events. A confession in the kitchen, a real apology, a repair that costs less than a legal review and more than a note. Perhaps that path was available. Perhaps our story might have bent differently. But people who keep secrets choose their own trajectories. I let her keep some small privacy, the names in her phone, the text threads she deleted. I saw no need to expose every private wound. I only exposed what affected the public trust she had been paid to guard. That was deliberate. My revenge was a lesson shaped without spectacle. It was, in the unromantic language I prefer, about restoring balance. In the end, I am left constructing a different life around the remnants. I still fix things, I still build. There is a purity in work that justice, in its own slow way, cannot fully replicate. The city moves on. The foundation appointed a new director and implemented reforms. Emily, when not under legal obligation, retreated from the public sphere and took a job that required fewer donors and more oversight. Michael restarted elsewhere, quieter. People have opinions. Some sympathize, some condemn, and some discuss the story like a parable of caution. I do not try to change their minds. I keep my ledger closed and my hands busy. If there is a lesson in all of this, for me and perhaps for others, it is this. The quiet, patient alignment of consequences to actions is the most devastating kind of justice because it cannot be dramatized away. If you've stayed with me to the end, thank you. Stories like this live in the liminal space where private failing meets public responsibility. They are messy, human, and sometimes manufactured into narratives we don't deserve. If you want more stories like this, raw, true feeling, and a little cold, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. If you have a story of betrayal or a revenge that taught you something, drop it in the comments. I read them. And if you find this gripping, share it. Maybe someone out there needs to know that silence can be a strategy, that numbers can tell truths words cannot, and that sometimes justice is not a spectacle but the slow recalculation of a life.